In the heart of the village of Ekuma, where thick mist often swallowed the mornings and whispers filled the night, there lived a girl named Adaora. She was 16, quiet, and mostly kept to herself. The villagers called her strange, not because she did anything odd, but because she often stared into space, as if speaking to someone no one else could see. Every night, Adaora woke up screaming, the same nightmare, the same eyes in the dark. She told her mother, but her mother said it was nothing, just a bad dream. Pray harder, her mother whispered one night, tucking her in. But prayer didn't help. If anything, it made the dreams worse. In her dreams, there was a room. Not her room, but a room with no windows, only a door that opened when the crying started. And it always started, the weeping of children, low and broken. A black figure would then crawl in, its arms long, bending wrong. Its voice, always the same, whispering her name slowly. Adaora. She stopped talking at school. She barely ate. Her skin grew pale, and her eyes, once bright, now looked hollow. The village priest visited. He prayed, threw water, and shouted things in tongues. But Adaora just stared ahead, lips sealed, hands trembling. Her mother lit candles. Her aunt slaughtered a goat and spread the blood at the doorway. But the demon kept coming. One night, she decided not to sleep. She sat in bed with a lantern by her feet. Midnight came, and with it, the wind changed. It hissed through the holes in the roof, dancing like whispers. The candle blew out. The room grew cold. Then the door creaked. It opened by itself. And what stepped in wasn't a dream. It stood tall, its eyes glowing like dying embers. It looked around the room slowly before locking its gaze on her. No voice, no words, just breathing, heavy and close. She couldn't scream. She couldn't move. The air grew thick, heavy. It felt like drowning while awake. The demon reached out its hand. Adaora blinked. She was no longer in her room. She was back in the place from her dreams. The dark room with no windows, no exits, and the weeping children all around her. And this time she was awake. She turned her head slowly. The children didn't look like children anymore. Their eyes were hollow, black holes with tears that streamed down endlessly. Their mouths moved, but no words came, only the sound of wind through leaves. Adaora's body refused to move. The floor felt like flesh, warm and uneven. She looked down and realized it pulsed beneath her like a heartbeat. Then she heard it again. The voice, the same one from the dreams, only this time it was deeper, closer. You saw us. You never should have seen us. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. Bigger than before, as tall as the ceiling, arms dragging along the ground, its head crooked sideways like it had no bones. It stepped forward, each movement silent, unnatural. The crying children froze. Their heads turned toward Adaora in one perfect, unified motion. She wanted to run, to scream, to wake up, but there was no waking up. The demon reached again. Its hand was larger now, covered in what looked like old, wet bark. It pressed one finger against her forehead, and then she saw everything. Not with her eyes, with her mind. Blood, fire, her village burning, her own mother crying, the priest being dragged into a pit. It wasn't a dream. It was a warning of what was coming. Adaora's lips parted, not in fear, but in understanding, as if her mind had unlocked a memory she never lived. The demon did not speak again, but images poured into her, faster than she could process. People screaming, running barefoot through the forest, a red river that flowed backwards, a voice chanting her name from underground. Adaora, Adaora. She clutched her chest. Something was inside her, not a presence, a weight, heavy, burning, like a second heart beating against her own. The crying around her stopped. The children vanished, sucked backward through the black walls. Only Adaora remained, and the demon. It bent toward her, eyes pulsing now like lanterns about to burst. Its mouth opened wide, wider than a face should stretch. There were no teeth, only void. "You are the door," it whispered. And then it disappeared, just like that. Gone. The room, the children, the cold, all vanished. Adaora found herself back in her bed, drenched in sweat, heart racing, light from the morning sun peeking through the holes in the roof. Her mother stood by the doorway, confused. "You were screaming again." But Adaora didn't answer. She was staring at her hands. They were covered in soil, and under her fingernails, something dark, something red. She didn't remember digging, but her body did. All day, Adaora stayed silent. She didn't eat, she didn't move, just sat by the doorway, watching the forest behind their hut. She blinked less. She breathed softer. Her mother began to worry again. By evening, the priest returned. He brought holy oil, a cross, and a Bible. He knelt before Adaora and started to pray, his voice rising, shaking. But as he chanted, Adaora slowly turned to him. Her eyes didn't look human. They were dull, like burnt wood. He froze mid-prayer. Adaora raised one hand and placed it gently on the priest's chest. He gasped and then collapsed. Her mother screamed. Adaora didn't flinch. She stood up, moved slowly, and walked outside barefoot. The villagers gathered. They stared. They whispered. Some crossed themselves. One woman spat on the ground, but no one came close, because in that moment, everyone felt it. The air thickening, the wind stilling, the earth beneath their feet vibrating faintly. Something was wrong. The sky darkened even though the sun had not yet set. Birds flew in circles, cawing madly. The animals went silent. Adaora walked through the center of the village, her hands slightly raised, as if feeling for something invisible. Children cried. Old men trembled. She reached the village square and stopped. Then she spoke, the first time in days. "He's coming." No one knew who she meant, but deep inside, they all felt it. He was already here. Later that night, 3 young boys who played near the river never returned home. At first, the villagers assumed they wandered too far, but by dawn, their bodies were found at the base of the old Iroko tree, the one no one touched. Their eyes were missing, not gouged, just gone. No blood, no wound, just skin where their eyes should be. The priest's body was never buried. It burned on its own in the middle of the chapel, leaving behind no smoke and no smell. The chapel bell rang by itself for hours. Adaora didn't cry. She didn't speak again. Instead, she started walking. Each morning, before the sun rose, barefoot into the forest. Villagers watched her from a distance. They dared not follow. The path behind her always closed, vines growing fast and thick, swallowing the trail as she passed. One night, a curious boy tried to wait by her house to follow her into the forest. He was brave, they said, but they never saw him again. Only his shirt, folded neatly on her doorstep by sunrise. Rumors grew. Some said Adaora wasn't human anymore. Others believed she was chosen, a vessel, a warning. The chief sent a message to neighboring villages asking for help, for a seer, a hunter, anyone who could explain what she had become. But no one came. Because the darkness wasn't just in Ikuma anymore. It had spread. Villages burned without fire. Rivers reversed. Graves opened. Children spoke in tongues. And every time it happened, Adaora was near. She was always near. Then, on the 7th night, she returned to Ikuma. No one had seen her leave. No one saw her arrive. But she was standing in the center of the square when the villagers woke. Not barefoot this time. She wore black robes, loose and trailing. Her hair had grown long and wild, threaded with vines and feathers. In her hand, she held a small clay bowl. It steamed, though no fire was near. Some said it smelled like rain. Others said it smelled like blood. She spoke only once that day. He asked for names. No one dared question her. That night, 11 names were whispered across the village. Names of those who had mocked her, who had called her cursed, who had prayed for her to die. By morning, those 11 people were gone. No bodies, no blood, just dust where they last stood. That same day, Adaora returned to her home. She hugged her mother for the first time in weeks. Her mother wept, but didn't speak. That night, the forest behind the village burned, silently, without flame. Trees blackened and fell inwards. The ground cracked open, and something stepped out. It was tall, taller than any man. Its skin was dark and rough like tree bark, its mouth wide and its eyes hollow. But what terrified them most wasn't what it was. It was who stood behind it. Adaora. She no longer looked like the girl they knew. Her feet no longer touched the ground. Her hair moved on its own. Her eyes were empty, not blind, but watching from somewhere far beyond. And when she spoke, her voice wasn't hers. "You opened the door." She pointed to the villagers. No one moved. No one breathed. Some dropped to their knees crying. Others tried to run but couldn't. The demon stepped forward, and the earth split beneath its feet. Black mist poured out. The air turned hot, heavy, suffocating. Adaora closed her eyes. Then came the scream, not from her, not from the demon, but from the village itself. A scream of earth and sky and all the ancestors long buried beneath. Ekuma was no more. Days passed, then weeks. No travelers spoke of Ekuma anymore. It was as if the village had never existed. On old maps, the name faded, the ink dulled. Forest swallowed every path, and wind carried whispers of a girl with empty eyes and feet that never touched the soil. But some say Adaora still walks. Not in Ekuma, but in places where the veil is thin, where children dream of crying shadows and trees twist toward the sky. In cities, she's a rumor. In villages, a warning. They say she appears before disasters, standing by rivers, wells, or schoolyards, her eyes fixed on nothing and everything. A hunter once claimed he saw her in the north, said she passed through his camp without leaving footprints. He woke with his beard turned white. He never spoke again. An old woman in the east carved her name into clay walls, saying it protected her family. When she died, the name was gone. And in a school in the capital, a little girl once whispered Adaora's name during nap time. That same night, the school burned. No cause, no survivors. The world forgets many things, but the land remembers. It remembers the child who saw what should not be seen. It remembers the village that disappeared without a trace. It remembers the demon that didn't knock, but entered. And it remembers Adaora. The door remains open. Somewhere tonight, a child will dream of a room with no windows, and the crying will begin again. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please give the video a like, share what you learned in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more enchanting tales like this one. Thank you for being part of the journey.